My name is Harriet Brooke, and I am 34 years old. Today, I am the Countess of Blackwood, a title that still feels foreign on my tongue, like a borrowed cloak. But the story I am about to tell you is not about how I married an earl. It is the story of how my sister's desperate, dramatic ploy for a hero's attention nearly cost me my life, and in the most terrifying and unexpected way, ended up saving it. It is the story of a trap set for one sister that caught another, and how in the ensuing darkness, a man looking for a beautiful doll found a woman of substance instead. The world thought my sister was the captivating one, the prize to be won. It took a ruthless gang of kidnappers and the threat of death for anyone to realize they had been looking at the wrong woman all along. Before I dive into the night of the midsummer ball, the night everything changed, I want you to settle in for this one. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and if you've ever felt overlooked or had someone else's drama completely derail your life, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the new viewers, make sure you subscribe, because this channel is a community for people who understand that sometimes the quietest people have the most incredible stories of survival. My sister, Isabella, was born for sunlight. I was born for shadows. From our earliest days at Brooke Manor, that was the unspoken truth that governed our lives. The manor itself, a sprawling but slowly crumbling estate of gray stone and ivy, seemed to reflect our family's fortunes, grand on the surface, but decaying from within. Isabella was the last brilliant bloom in a dying garden, and our parents tended to her with a desperate, all-consuming focus. She had our mother's porcelain skin and our father's charming smile, a combination that made her incandescent. Her laughter was like wind chimes, her tears were theatrical masterpieces, and her desires were royal decrees. The household orbited her. I, on the other hand, was quiet. I had a calmer, more muted version of our family's features. The same dark hair, but without Isabella's fiery glint. The same blue eyes, but without her stormy depths. I was the steady, unseen hand that kept the crumbling manor from collapsing entirely. While Isabella was practicing her waltz or charming visiting gentry, I was in the kitchens ensuring the dwindling supplies would stretch another week, or in the library with our father's ledgers, trying to make sense of the mounting debts he preferred to ignore. My father, Lord Brooke, would pat my head and call me his sensible little mouse, a term of affection that felt more like a cage. A mouse is useful, quiet, and easily forgotten in the walls. I remember one particular afternoon when I was 17. A neighboring baron and his son were visiting, the son being a potential suitor for Isabella, of course. I had spent 2 days ensuring the visit would be perfect. I'd personally polished the silver, what little we had left that hadn't been sold, and instructed the cook on how to prepare the venison to disguise its slight toughness. Isabella swept into the drawing room a fashionable 20 minutes late, wearing a new gown of sapphire silk that must have cost a fortune we did not have. She was a vision. She told a dramatic, funny story about a runaway pony, her hands fluttering like doves, her eyes sparkling. The baron and his son were utterly enchanted. No one noticed that the tea was perfectly hot, or that the fire in the hearth burned without a hint of smoke. They only saw the star of the show. Later that evening, after they had departed, my father praised Isabella for her dazzling performance. "You may have secured our future today, my jewel," he'd said, beaming. He turned to me, where I was quietly clearing away the teacups. "And thank you, Harriet, for being so wonderfully quiet. You allowed your sister to shine." He meant it as a compliment. I went to my room that night and cried into my pillow, not with sadness, but with a hollow sort of resignation. It was my lot in life to be the stage upon which my sister's brilliance was displayed. I found my solace in books and in my sketchbook. I would retreat to the gardens or the dusty, forgotten corners of the manor and draw. I drew the intricate patterns of frost on a window pane, the tired lines on the face of our head housekeeper, the way the light fell across the worn spines of the books in the library. In my art, I could be precise, noticed, and in control. My subjects were quiet things, strong things, things that endured without applause. I suppose I was drawing myself, in a way. This was the state of our world when the arrival of Lord Clifford Dawson, the Earl of Blackwood, sent a tremor through our county. His estate bordered ours, a vast, thriving expanse of land that made our own look like a pauper's hovel. He was more than just wealthy, he was a hero. He had distinguished himself in a small but brutal colonial skirmish, and tales of his bravery were whispered in every drawing room. He was handsome, unmarried, and possessed a gravity that made other young men seem like frivolous boys. For Isabella, he was not a man, he was the ultimate prize, the culmination of her life's work. "He is mine, Harriet," she declared the morning after his arrival was announced. She was standing before her mirror, pinching her cheeks to bring color to them. "The Earl of Blackwood will be my husband. Father says his fortune could restore Brook Manor to its former glory. It is my duty." I watched her reflection, seeing the steel beneath the silk. Her sense of duty was always conveniently aligned with her own ambition. Their first meeting was at a dinner party hosted by a mutual neighbor. I was there, of course, a silent shadow in a drab gray dress, seated at the far end of the table. Isabella was a masterpiece of calculated charm. She listened to Clifford's stories with wide, innocent eyes, her head tilted at the perfect angle of adoration. She spoke of her love for the countryside, a love that I knew extended only to manicured lawns and garden parties. I watched the Earl. He was polite, attentive, and impeccably mannered. But I saw something in his eyes, a weariness that her performance did not seem to touch. He seemed to be listening to a song he had heard many times before. At one point, as the ladies were preparing to withdraw, my small clutch purse slipped from my lap, spilling its meager contents onto the floor. A tiny pencil, a folded piece of drawing paper, and a handkerchief. Before I could even react, Lord Blackwood was there, kneeling to gather the items. His large, capable hands retrieved the pencil and the paper. He paused for a fraction of a second, his thumb brushing over the corner of the paper where a sketch of a robin was visible. He looked up, and his eyes, a deep, thoughtful gray, met mine. For the first time all evening, the polite mask seemed to slip. He saw me. "Miss Brooke," he said, his voice low and surprisingly gentle. "I believe this is yours." He handed me the items, his fingers brushing mine. It was a jolt, a spark of warmth in my cold, invisible world. Isabella, seeing his attention diverted, immediately created a distraction, laughing loudly at some forgotten joke. The moment was over, but I held it close, a secret treasure. He had called me Miss Brooke, not just Isabella's sister. Weeks turned into a few months. The Earl was a frequent visitor to the county, and Isabella intensified her campaign. She arranged for them to accidentally meet during his morning rides. She feigned an interest in military history. She was relentless, and yet Clifford remained a perfect gentleman, attentive but distant. He had not proposed. He had not even declared any specific intention. For Isabella, who was used to men falling at her feet, this was an infuriating, incomprehensible failure. The desperation began to curdle the air at Brook Manor. My father grew more anxious, my mother more irritable. The pressure on Isabella was immense, and she, in turn, became a storm cloud in the house, her moods dark and unpredictable. It was during this tense period that I began to hear whispers. I was mending one of Father's coats in the sewing room, a small chamber that shared a thin wall with Isabella's dressing room. Her voice, usually so melodic, was sharp, conspiratorial. She was speaking to her maid, a young, impressionable girl named Lucy. "He is a hero, Lucy," Isabella was saying, her voice laced with theatrical fervor. "And a hero needs something to conquer, someone to save. He is bored of parlor games. I must give him a real quest." My needle paused mid-stitch. I knew that tone. It was the sound of a grand, ill-advised scheme being born. I leaned closer to the wall, my heart beginning to pound with a vague sense of dread. "The midsummer ball is in 2 weeks," Isabella continued, her voice dropping. "Everyone will be here. The Earl will be here. It is the perfect stage." She went on to lay out the most insane plan I had ever heard. She would feign a kidnapping. She would have Lucy leave a ransom note in the library, a dramatic, poetic plea for her champion to find her. The note would contain a riddle, pointing to the old, abandoned groundskeeper's cottage at the far edge of the woods. Isabella would slip away from the ball, hide herself in the cottage, and wait for the heroic Earl of Blackwood to follow the clues, burst in, and rescue her from her self-imposed peril. In the romantic moonlit aftermath of this ordeal, he would surely be overcome with emotion and propose. I sat back in my chair, the coat lying forgotten in my lap. It was ludicrous. It was something out of a cheap novel. It was so perfectly Isabella. My first instinct was to burst in and tell her how foolish, how dangerous, how utterly mad she was. But I hesitated. What would it achieve? She would fly into a rage, accuse me of jealousy, of trying to sabotage her one chance at happiness. My father would side with her, telling me not to meddle. I would be the villain, the plain, bitter sister trying to spoil the beautiful one's triumph. And a part of me, a weary, cynical part, simply dismissed it. It was another one of her dramas. She'd probably lose her nerve at the last minute. It was all just talk. That was my great mistake. I underestimated the sheer force of her desperation. I went back to my mending, trying to push the conversation from my mind, telling myself it was not my concern. I convinced myself that by saying nothing, I was choosing peace. I did not realize I was choosing catastrophe. In my quiet, sensible way, I was helping to bait the trap, never dreaming that I would be the one to walk into it. The days leading up to the midsummer ball were thick with a strange electric tension. Isabella was a whirlwind of activity, her mood swinging wildly between giddy excitement and nervous agitation. She spent hours selecting the perfect gown, a shimmering creation of emerald green that made her eyes look like jewels. She practiced looking pale and frightened in her mirror, an exercise I found both absurd and chilling. She drafted and redrafted her ridiculous ransom note on scented paper, her quill scratching dramatically in the quiet of her room. "To the noble heart who dares to seek the stolen dove," it began. I caught a glimpse of it on her desk and had to suppress a sigh. Our father, oblivious to the plot, saw only her heightened color and attributed it to the thrill of the season. He was more hopeful than I had seen him in years, convinced that the Earl was on the verge of declaring himself. "Your sister has him, Harriet," he said to me one evening, his voice full of relief. "She has saved us." I merely nodded, the lie feeling like a stone in my throat. My own feelings were a tangled mess of anxiety and a strange, detached curiosity. I wondered if the Earl was truly so blind as to fall for such a transparent theatrical production. The man who had knelt to pick up my sketchbook, whose eyes held such quiet intelligence, seemed above such manipulation. Or perhaps I was the naive one, mistaking common courtesy for depth of character. On the night of the ball, Brook Manor was transformed. Lanterns glowed in the trees along the drive, and the sound of a string quartet drifted from the ballroom. For a few hours, the decay was hidden beneath a veneer of frantic festivity. The ballroom was crowded with the local gentry, the air heavy with perfume and whispered gossip. Isabella, as planned, was the undeniable center of it all. Her emerald gown was a beacon, and she moved through the room with the grace of a queen, bestowing smiles and witty remarks as if they were precious gifts. I had chosen a simple dress of pale lavender, a color that helped me blend into the tapestries. I found a quiet alcove near the French doors that led to the terrace, content to watch the spectacle unfold. From my vantage point, I could see Isabella and Lord Blackwood. He was devastatingly handsome in his formal attire, but the weary look I had noticed before was still there, etched subtly around his eyes. He was dancing with Isabella, guiding her through a waltz with practiced ease, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He looked like a man performing a duty, and a difficult one at that. Isabella, however, was in her element. She gazed up at him, her expression a perfect blend of adoration and vulnerability. At the end of the waltz, I saw her touch his arm and whisper something to him, her eyes wide and pleading. He nodded, his expression unreadable. This was it. The performance was beginning. The evening air grew cooler, and many guests, including myself, had brought cloaks. Mine was a simple, dark blue woolen cloak, a practical garment against the night's chill. Isabella's was a far more dramatic affair, a deep forest green velvet that matched her dress. It was a detail that seemed insignificant at the time, but would prove to be of monumental importance. Feeling overwhelmed by the heat and noise of the ballroom, I slipped out onto the stone terrace. The cool air was a relief. I watched Isabella, still inside, laugh at something the Earl said, the picture of carefree beauty. Then, with a final, lingering look at him, she turned and swept out onto the opposite end of the terrace, a dramatic silhouette against the lanterns. She paused at the top of the garden steps, drew her green cloak around her shoulders, and disappeared into the darkness, heading in the direction of the woods and the old cottage. The play had begun. I stayed on the terrace for a few more minutes, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The whole thing felt wrong, cheapening the very real anxieties of our family into a childish game. I couldn't bear to watch the fallout. I decided to walk in the opposite direction, through the less tended part of the rose garden, a place I often went for solitude. I pulled my own dark blue cloak tightly around me, the color nearly black in the dim moonlight, and descended a different set of steps, seeking the peace of the familiar paths. The music from the ballroom became a faint, muffled pulse. The scent of night-blooming jasmine filled the air. I let out a slow breath, trying to release the tension that had been building all evening. I thought of Lord Blackwood's tired eyes. I thought of my sister, sitting alone in a dusty cottage, waiting for a manufactured hero. It was this thought that occupied my mind so completely that I didn't hear the rustle in the overgrown hedgerow beside the path. I didn't register the snap of a twig behind me until it was too late. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat just as two figures emerged from the shadows. They were large men, dressed in rough, dark clothing, their faces obscured by the gloom. Before I could scream, a coarse, foul-smelling hand clamped over my mouth, stifling my cry. Another arm, strong as an iron band, wrapped around my waist, lifting me off my feet. I struggled, kicking and twisting, my mind reeling with a terrifying, absolute confusion. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't a game. The velvet cloaks and scented notes of Isabella's fantasy evaporated, replaced by the brutal reality of rough hands and the cold glint of a knife in the moonlight. Panic, raw and blinding, seized me. One of the men grumbled, his voice a low rasp. "She's stronger than she looks. Get her legs." My cloak, my simple blue cloak that looked so dark in the night, was tangled around me. They must have been waiting for the glint of green velvet, for Isabella, but in the deceptive light of the moon, one dark-cloaked daughter of a lord was as good as another. A piece of cloth was shoved into my mouth, gagging me, the taste of dirt and sweat filling my senses. My arms were wrenched behind my back and tied with a cruel efficiency. They dragged me through the hedgerow, the thorns tearing at my dress and scratching my skin. I was thrown, not gently, into the back of a waiting carriage. The door slammed shut, plunging me into a suffocating blackness. As the carriage lurched forward, jolting over the uneven ground, a single horrifying thought screamed through my mind. They had taken the wrong sister. The world inside the carriage was a nightmare of sound and motion. The rattling of the wheels, the creak of the cheap leather, the pounding of my own heart against my ribs. I was wedged onto the floor, my cheek pressed against the rough, splintered wood. The gag was tight, making it hard to breathe, and the ropes on my wrists were already chafing my skin raw. Fear was a living thing inside me, a cold, predatory animal with its claws in my chest. Yet beneath the terror, a strange and terrible clarity began to dawn. The disgruntled former groom father had dismissed without pay 3 months ago. I remembered the way he had looked at us, his eyes full of a simmering resentment. Had he spoken to someone? Had he told them of our supposed wealth, of the valuable earl visiting our impoverished estate? Isabella's fake kidnapping, her stupid, selfish game, had painted a target. She had broadcast to the world that a daughter of Brooke was ripe for the taking, and someone far more dangerous than she had been listening. Back at the ball, the gears of Isabella's little drama were grinding into motion. As she had instructed, her maid Lucy, her face pale with a mixture of excitement and terror, discovered the ransom note on a table in the library. She ran, shrieking, into the ballroom, holding the scented paper aloft like a flag of surrender. The music screeched to a halt. Panic, just as Isabella had envisioned, erupted. My mother gave a convincing swoon. My father, his face ashen, bellowed for his staff, for the stable hands, for anyone. It was perfect chaos, the ideal stage for a hero to emerge. And emerge he did. Lord Clifford Dawson immediately took command. His voice, calm and authoritative, cut through the panicked chatter. He read the note, his brow furrowed. "To the noble heart who dares to seek the stolen dove," he read aloud, a flicker of something unreadable, annoyance, disbelief in his eyes. He organized the men into search parties, dispatching them to the grounds with lanterns. "I will follow the riddle's path myself," he announced, his jaw set. "I will find her." He played his part perfectly. He made his way to the edge of the woods, following the note's flowery and ridiculously easy clues. He found the old groundskeeper's cottage, its windows dark, a single sliver of light showing beneath the door. He did not, as Isabella had fantasized, kick the door in. He opened it quietly and stepped inside. Isabella was posed artfully on a dusty chaise lounge, her green velvet cloak draped around her, her hair artfully disheveled. She had even managed to smudge a bit of dirt on her cheek for effect. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with feigned relief. "Oh, my lord," she breathed. "You found me. I was so frightened." Clifford simply stood there, his expression hardening. The weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, sharp anger. "What is the meaning of this, Miss Brooke?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Isabella's triumphant smile faltered. This was not the reaction she had scripted. They brought me here," she stammered. "Brutes. Stop," he said, the single word cutting her off. "Stop this foolish game. Your maid is hysterical. Your father is on the verge of collapse. You have terrified half the county for what? For a moment of drama?" The color drained from Isabella's face, replaced by a blotchy, indignant red. "It was for you," she cried, her voice rising. "I thought, a hero like you needed to save someone." "I am not a character in one of your novels," Clifford bit back, his patience gone. "I am a man who has seen real violence, real fear, and you dare to mock it with this pantomime?" It was at that precise moment of humiliating revelation that the cottage door burst open again. It was one of the estate managers, his face wild with genuine panic, his torch casting frantic shadows on the walls. He didn't even seem to register Isabella's presence. He addressed himself only to the Earl. My Lord Blackwood, we found something in the gardens, in the old rose path on the west side." He was gasping for breath. "A lady's slipper. It's Miss Harriet's, and there are signs of a terrible struggle. The ground is torn up, and this," he held up a small, dark object. It was a button, ripped from a man's coarse coat, something that did not belong to any of the liveried servants or guests. Clifford stared at the slipper, then at the button. The air in the tiny cottage grew thick and cold. He turned his gaze slowly from the evidence in the man's hand to Isabella, who was now standing, her jaw slack with disbelief. The fake ransom note, the staged disappearance. It had all been a distraction, a perfect cover, a coincidence so terrible, so perfectly timed that it could only be real. The truth landed on him with the force of a physical blow. He had been chasing a phantom while a real woman, the quiet sister, the one no one ever thought to worry about, had been dragged into a true nightmare. His face, when he finally looked at Isabella, was a mask of utter contempt. "What have you done?" he whispered, the words filled with a dawning horror that was far more terrifying than any of his earlier anger. Isabella had wanted a hero, but in her selfish, reckless game, she had just created a monster of guilt and responsibility and pointed him toward her own sister. The carriage ride felt like an eternity. I was bounced and jolted in the darkness, the rough cloth of the gag scraping my lips, the ropes burning my wrists. Every lurch of the wheels sent a fresh wave of nausea and terror through me. My mind, however, was surprisingly sharp. The initial blinding panic had subsided into a cold, focused dread. I started to take stock of my situation, to fight back in the only way I could. I listened. There were 3 of them. I could distinguish their voices. One was the gruff, low-voiced man who had grabbed me. Another was younger, his voice higher-pitched and nervous. But the third voice was the one that commanded the others. It was calm, measured, and laced with chilling intelligence. This was the leader. I strained to hear their words over the noise of the carriage. "Did you see the Earl?" the young one asked, his voice cracking. Blackwood himself was there. All the better, the leader's voice replied, smooth as polished stone. A hero in the house makes the prize more valuable. The family will be desperate. They'll pay anything to avoid embarrassment in front of such a guest. She's the wrong one, Silas, the gruff one grumbled. The note we got from the groom, said the pretty one. The one in green. This one was in blue. A pause. Then the leader, Silas, spoke again, his voice dangerously soft. A lord's daughter is a lord's daughter. One is as good as another, perhaps even better. The pretty ones are often the least loved. It is the quiet ones, the useful ones, that a family cannot afford to lose. His words sent a fresh spike of fear through me. He was not just a brute, he was calculating. He understood dynamics, weaknesses. This was not a crime of opportunity, it was planned. After what felt like hours, the carriage finally shuddered to a halt. The door was thrown open, and I was hauled out into the cold night air. We were in a desolate, wind-swept place. Looming before us was the skeletal ruin of an old watchtower, a stone finger pointing at a star-littered sky. They dragged me inside, up a crumbling spiral staircase, and into a small circular room at the top. The only light came from a single, sputtering lantern that cast long, dancing shadows on the damp stone walls. They cut the ropes on my feet, but left my hands bound and the gag in my mouth. The leader, Silas, stepped into the light, and I saw him clearly for the first time. He was not a hulking monster. He was a man of average height, lean and wiry, with sharp features and eyes as black and hard as chips of obsidian. There was a cruel intelligence in his face that was far more frightening than simple muscle. He circled me like a wolf, inspecting its prey. "Welcome to your new accommodations, my lady," he said, a mocking smile playing on his lips. "I trust they are not up to your usual standards." I met his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to show him the terror that was churning in my stomach. I would not give him the satisfaction. I had been a mouse my whole life, but even a cornered mouse will bite. My silence, my stillness, seemed to unnerve him more than tears would have. He studied my face for a long moment. "You are Harriet, then," he stated. Not a question. The quiet one. He reached out, and before I could flinch away, he ripped the gag from my mouth. I gasped, drawing in a ragged breath of the musty air. "My name is Silas Abrams," he said, his voice dropping. "Does that name mean anything to you?" I shook my head, my throat too dry to speak. His smile widened, but it held no warmth. "No, I suppose it wouldn't, but perhaps the name Abrams Farm, on the northern edge of the Blackwood estate, does. My grandfather worked that land. My father was born on it. Until your grandfather, Lord Brooke, decided a sheep pasture would be more profitable. He threw them out with nothing but the clothes on their backs. My father died a beggar in a ditch because of your family's greed." The pieces clicked into place. This was not about ransom. Not entirely. This was revenge, decades in the making. Meanwhile, Lord Clifford Dawson was a man possessed. Guilt was a poison in his veins. He had been played for a fool by one sister while the other was suffering a fate he couldn't bear to imagine. Back at the cottage, he had silenced Isabella with a single, glacial look. "Not one more word from you," he had commanded. He then turned his full attention to the rescue. He was no longer a polite earl. He was the soldier he had once been. He examined the button, the scuff marks on the ground, the deep ruts of the carriage wheels. "They're professionals," he said to my father, his voice clipped and precise. This wasn't a crime of passion. They were waiting. He ignored my father's blustering and my mother's hysterics. He took charge with a swift, cold efficiency. He sent a rider to the magistrate, but knew it would be too slow. He trusted only himself. With his most loyal man, a grim-faced former sergeant named Thomas, he set off on horseback, following the tracks that were still visible in the soft earth of the lane. He pushed his horse relentlessly, his mind racing. He remembered my face in the dim light of the dining room, the shy surprise in my eyes when he had returned my sketchbook. He remembered my quiet presence at the edge of every gathering, my steadfast, unassuming nature. He had been so focused on Isabella's blinding light that he had failed to see the steady, gentle flame burning beside her. And now, because of his blindness and her sister's vanity, that flame was in danger of being extinguished. The guilt spurred him on, a sharper motivation than any call to glory had ever been. He tracked us for hours, through the night and into the gray light of dawn, his military training serving him well, where a civilian posse would have been lost. The tracks led toward the desolate hills, toward the old borderlands dotted with ancient ruins from a more violent time, toward the watchtowers. In my stone prison, I knew that waiting to be rescued was not an option. I had to create an opportunity. I watched my captors. The gruff one, whose name was Ben, and the young one, Finn, were clearly just hired muscle. Finn, in particular, looked miserable. He kept glancing at me with wide, fearful eyes, as if my presence was a weight on his conscience. Silas was the true danger. He sat on a crate, sharpening a knife, his movements economical and precise, his black eyes missing nothing. I decided to take a risk. I spoke, my voice raspy but clear. "He'll never pay," I said. Silas stopped sharpening his knife. He looked up, an eyebrow raised. "Who won't pay?" "My father," I said, forcing a steadiness I did not feel. "We have no money. That's why my sister is so desperate to marry a rich man. The estate is mortgaged to the hilt. Selling me back to him would be like trying to sell water to a dry well. There is nothing there." Silas laughed, a short, harsh sound. "A clever lie, my lady, but a lie nonetheless." "It's the truth," I insisted, directing my words now to the younger man. "Finn, look at my dress. Does this look like the gown of a wealthy woman? My family's pride is all they have left. My sister, she was their last hope." My voice cracked on the last words, and for the first time, it was not an act. A tear slid down my cheek. Finn looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I had planted a seed of doubt. The confrontation came as dusk began to fall on the second day. Clifford and Thomas had found the tower. They approached with the stealth of ghosts, leaving their horses tethered in a grove of trees. Clifford scaled the lower part of the crumbling wall with a rope, his movements silent and sure. He peered through a crack in the stone, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw me, pale and exhausted but alive, my hands still bound. He saw Silas, a predator at rest. He saw the other two men. A direct assault would be suicide. He needed a distraction. It was I who provided it. I saw a flicker of movement through a slit of a window, a shadow that did not belong. Hope, fierce and sharp, surged through me. I knew I had one chance. My eyes darted around the room. The lantern sat on a rickety wooden crate, and next to it was a pile of dry, dusty straw that had probably once been used for bedding. My gaze locked onto it. I started to talk again, my voice rising, becoming more desperate, drawing Silas's attention. "Please," I begged, looking directly at him. "Let me go. I'll tell no one. I swear it." It was the perfect picture of a pleading damsel, everything I was not. It was a performance, just like my sister's, but mine had a purpose beyond vanity. Silas smirked, enjoying my apparent breakdown. "It's a little late for pleading, my lady." As he took a step toward me, I made my move. With a sudden, desperate lunge, I kicked the wooden crate with all my might. It crashed over. The lantern shattered on the stone floor, the oil spilling across the dry straw. It ignited with a whoosh, a wall of flame and black smoke erupting between me and my captors. The room was plunged into chaos. Finn and Ben yelled in shock, batting at the flames. Silas swore, momentarily blinded. It was the opening Clifford needed. He burst through the rotten wooden door, Thomas right behind him. The fight was brutal and swift. Clifford moved with a deadly grace, his entire being focused on the threat. He disarmed Ben with a sharp blow and engaged Silas in a furious clash of steel, Silas's knife against a short sword Clifford carried. In the swirling smoke and fire, I scrambled away from the flames, my bound hands making it clumsy. My mind was screaming, "This is it. This is your chance." I wasn't waiting to be saved. I was part of my own rescue. As Clifford and Silas battled, Finn, the young, terrified kidnapper, turned toward me, his face a mask of panic. In that moment, I saw not a monster, but a scared boy in over his head. Clifford was occupied. Thomas was struggling with the larger man, Ben. Finn was my problem to solve. He lunged for me, to grab me, to use me as a shield. I did the only thing I could. I lowered my head and charged, ramming my shoulder into his stomach with every ounce of strength I had. He gasped, stumbling backward, tripping over a loose stone and crashing to the floor, stunned. Clifford saw my action out of the corner of his eye. He saw me, the quiet mouse, not cowering in a corner, but fighting. It seemed to fuel him. With a powerful surge, he broke through Silas's defense and sent the knife clattering across the floor. He didn't kill him. He delivered a precise, calculated blow to the side of Silas's head with the pommel of his sword, and the man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Thomas had subdued Ben. The fire was spreading, licking up the old wooden beams of the ceiling. "We have to go, now," Clifford yelled. He rushed to my side, his knife slicing through the ropes on my wrists. His hands were gentle as he helped me to my feet, his gray eyes searching my face, full of 1,000 questions and a dawning, profound respect. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with smoke and concern. I could only nod, my throat tight. As we scrambled for the stairs, Silas began to stir. He pushed himself up on one elbow, a trickle of blood running from his temple. He looked at us, his black eyes burning with pure hatred. He spat on the floor. "You've come for the wrong sister, my lord," he sneered, his voice a venomous rasp, "the one no one would even pay for." Clifford paused on the top step, turning to look down at the defeated man in the burning room. He pulled me closer to his side, his arm a protective shield. His voice, when he replied, was cold and clear, and echoed in the enclosed space, a pronouncement that would change my life forever. "I've come for the only one worth saving." We plunged down the stairs and out into the clean, cool night, leaving the tower to burn against the darkening sky, a funeral pyre for the woman I used to be. The journey back to Brook Manor was a strange, suspended dream. The adrenaline of the fight and the fire slowly leached away, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and a quiet, surreal peace. Clifford insisted I ride his horse while he and Thomas walked alongside, a silent, protective guard. He had wrapped his own coat around my shoulders, and the scent of leather, horse, and smoke was a strangely comforting anchor in the dizzying aftermath of my ordeal. We didn't speak for the first hour. The only sounds were the clip-clop of the horse's hooves and the chirping of crickets in the darkness. My mind was a tumult of images. The glint of Silas's knife, the whoosh of the fire, the look in Clifford's eyes when he'd called me the only one worth saving. He had said it to wound a villain, of course, a retort in the heat of the moment. It couldn't possibly be true. Yet the words had landed in the barren, hollow part of my soul and taken root. Finally, Clifford broke the silence. His voice was low, careful. "Your wrists," he said, "are they paining you?" "They're fine," I lied, though they were throbbing. I didn't want to be a burden. He stopped the horse gently. "Let me see." Before I could protest, he took my hand. In the pale moonlight, he examined the raw red welts left by the ropes. He let out a soft sound of regret and anger. From his saddlebag, he produced a small tin of salve and a clean strip of linen. With an incredible gentleness, he began to treat the burns. His touch was warm and steady, a stark contrast to the brutal hands that had bound me. "I am so sorry, Harriet," he murmured, not looking at my face, focusing on his task. "This is my fault. I was blind. I saw the performance and not the play. I should have seen what your sister was." "It was not your fault," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "It was hers. And mine. I heard her planning it. I said nothing. The confession spilled out of me, a shameful secret I had carried for 2 days." He looked up then, his gray eyes meeting mine. There was no judgment in them, only a deep, weary understanding. "You were trapped," he said, "in a different kind of prison, but trapped all the same. We all were." He finished wrapping my wrist, and his hand lingered on mine for a moment longer than necessary. "You were incredibly brave back there. Throwing the lantern, that was not the act of a terrified victim, it was the act of a soldier." A small, surprised laugh escaped me. "My father calls me his little mouse." "Then he is a fool," Clifford said simply, with no malice, just a statement of fact. "He has kept a lioness and mistaken her for a house pet." We started moving again, but the silence now was different. It was comfortable, filled with a new, fragile understanding. He asked me about my drawing. He asked about the books I read. He listened, truly listened, as I spoke of the quiet things that filled my life. I found myself talking more than I had in years, the words flowing easily, without fear of interruption or dismissal. He, in turn, told me of his time in the army, not the heroic tales Isabella had tried to pry from him, but the quiet, grim realities, the boredom, the fear, the burden of command. By the time the first rays of dawn were painting the sky, and the tired, familiar shape of Brook Manor appeared on the horizon, I felt as if I had known this man my entire life. I was no longer just Isabella's sister, and he was no longer just the Earl of Blackwood. We were two people who had seen the truth of each other in the light of a fire. Our arrival was met with a scene of controlled chaos. My father and a handful of servants were gathered on the main steps, their faces etched with worry. When they saw us, a collective sigh of relief went through the group. My father rushed forward, his face a mixture of relief and paternal anger. "Harriet, my dear girl, are you harmed?" He fussed over me for a moment, before his attention was immediately consumed by the implications of the event. "A scandal, an abduction. What will the county say?" My mother appeared, her eyes red-rimmed. She hugged me tightly, but then immediately began asking a flurry of questions about my captors, my treatment, the horror of it all, her voice tinged with a morbid, theatrical excitement. They were relieved I was safe, but their primary concern seemed to be how this story would play. Then Isabella appeared in the doorway. She had changed out of her ball gown and into a simple morning dress, but she looked terrible. Her face was pale and puffy, her eyes filled with a toxic brew of resentment, fear, and jealousy. She saw the Earl's coat around my shoulders. She saw the way he stood protectively beside me. She saw the wrapped linen on my wrists. Her entire, carefully constructed world had been shattered, not by her own drama, but by my reality. She walked slowly toward us. She didn't look at Clifford. Her eyes were fixed on me. "They took you by mistake," she said, the words coming out as an accusation, as if it were somehow my fault for being in the wrong place. I looked at my sister, at the beautiful, selfish girl who had orchestrated this entire catastrophe. The fear I had always held of her moods, her anger, her power over our family, was gone. It had been burned away in the watchtower. I met her gaze, and my voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of everything I had survived. "Yes," I said, "they did." I paused, letting the truth of it settle between us in the cool morning air. "And I'm glad of it." Isabella flinched as if I had struck her. In that moment, we both knew that the balance of power in our family had shifted, irrevocably and forever. The mouse had finally found her roar. In the weeks that followed, Brook Manor was a house of ghosts. The ghost of Isabella's reputation, which had evaporated overnight, the ghost of our family's financial hopes, and the ghost of the relationship my sister and I once had. Isabella confined herself to her rooms, emerging only for meals, where she sat in sullen, resentful silence. The story, as stories do, had gotten out, not the whole truth, but enough of it. The whispers were everywhere, a staged kidnapping, a real one, the Earl's fury, the quiet sister's ordeal. Isabella, who had lived for the spotlight, was now scorched by it. She had wanted to be the heroine of a romance. Instead, she had become the villain of a tragedy. My father and mother treated me with a new, awkward deference. They did not know what to do with me. I was no longer the reliable, invisible mouse. I had survived something they couldn't comprehend, and I had been brought back by the very man they had hoped would save them. Their conversations with me were stilted, as if they were speaking to a stranger. They couldn't bring themselves to apologize for their blindness, for the years of neglect that had made me a footnote in my own family. Instead, they just tiptoed around me, their guilt a palpable presence in every room. Lord Blackwood was a constant, steady presence in that tumultuous time. He handled the legalities with the magistrate, ensuring Silas Abrams and his men faced justice. Silas, it turned out, confessed everything, his bitterness toward my family making him boastful of his crime. He seemed to take a perverse pleasure in detailing how he had intended to bleed my father dry. The younger man, Finn, expressed deep remorse and received a lighter sentence, a fact for which I was quietly grateful. Clifford called on our family nearly every day. The first few times he was formal, paying his respects to my father and inquiring after the entire family's well-being. But on the third visit, he asked my father for permission to speak with me alone. We walked in the garden, the same garden where I had been taken. It felt strange to be back there, but with him by my side, the shadows held no fear. He didn't speak of the kidnapping. He spoke of his own estate, of his plans to improve the tenant farms, of his love for his library. He asked for my opinion on crop rotation and then on a new book of poetry he was reading. He treated me not as a fragile creature to be protected, but as an equal, an intelligent woman whose thoughts he valued. This, more than any dramatic rescue, was the true salvation. He saw me, Harriet, not as an extension of my sister or my family, but as myself. One afternoon, he brought a portfolio with him. "I was hoping you might show me some of your drawings," he said. Hesitantly, I retrieved my sketchbook. I had never shown it to anyone before. It felt like baring my soul. He sat beside me on a garden bench and turned the pages with a reverent care. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He commented on my use of shadow, the detail in the stonework of a crumbling wall, the life I had captured in the eyes of a portrait of our old housekeeper. "You see the world as it is, Harriet," he said, his voice soft with wonder. "The beauty in the things that endure, the strength in the things that are quiet." He looked at me then, his gray eyes serious. "I have been surrounded by performance and artifice for so long. You are the truest person I have ever known." Our courtship, for that is what it became, was a quiet, gentle thing. It was built on shared conversations, long walks, and the silent understanding of two people who had been tested and not found wanting. My father watched it all with a bewildered hope. He had gotten his Earl, but through the wrong daughter. Isabella attempted one final, desperate gambit. She cornered Clifford in the drawing room one day, dressed in a fetching gown, her eyes full of practiced tears. I was in the hall and could not help but overhear. "My lord," she began, her voice trembling, "I have been so foolish. My actions were born of a desperate heart. Can you not find it in yourself to forgive a woman who acted only out of affection for you?" Clifford's reply was calm, but utterly final. "Miss Brooke," he said, and the formality was a blade. "Your actions put your sister's life in mortal danger. That is not affection. It is a selfishness so profound I can scarcely comprehend it. The woman I have come to admire is the one who faced true danger with courage and grace, not the one who invented it for attention. I wish you well, but my heart and my respect are already given." I heard the sound of Isabella's strangled sob, and then the door opened. Clifford saw me standing there. He simply came to me, took my hand, and led me back out into the sunlight. 6 months later, he proposed to me on that same garden bench where he had looked at my drawings. He did not speak of my fortune or my family's status. He spoke of his desire for a partner, a companion, a friend. He spoke of wanting to build a life with the strongest, bravest woman he had ever known. And I, the quiet mouse from the shadows, said yes. Years have passed. I am the Countess of Blackwood now, mistress of a thriving estate and a happy, bustling home. Clifford and I are partners in every sense of the word. My art hangs on our walls, no longer hidden away in a sketchbook. My opinion is sought, my presence is cherished. My sister Isabella eventually married a minor baronet with more ambition than sense. Her beauty faded, and without the adoration she craved, she became a bitter, complaining woman. We are civil, but the chasm that opened between us that night never truly closed. My parents live out their days in a dower house on our estate, financially secure but emotionally impoverished, never quite understanding the daughter who saved them by being herself. Sometimes, late at night, I think of that burning watchtower. I think of how the worst night of my life was the catalyst for my liberation. It taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. It taught me that true worth isn't about being the brightest object in the room, but about possessing an inner light that no shadow can extinguish. Isabella's trap, meant to ensnare a hero, accidentally set me free. She wanted a man to see her as a prize to be won. But in the end, Clifford found something far more valuable, a woman who was already whole, just waiting for someone to finally see her. My journey has taught me that your value is not determined by who acknowledges it. It exists, constant and true, whether you are in the spotlight or in the shadows. Sometimes the world needs a dramatic, life-threatening event to finally open its eyes and see you for who you truly are. But you must never wait for that. You must know your own worth, even when no one else does. I'd love to hear your own stories in the comments below. Have you ever been underestimated only to surprise everyone, including yourself? Share your experience, because these stories give us all strength. Please don't forget to like this video if my story resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories about finding your power in the most unexpected of places. Thank you for listening to my story today. Remember that the quietest voices often have the most important things to say. Be well and be brave.